Welcome to another edition of the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. The Yanks are coming, Tim. The Yanks are flipping coming. Wherever you look in football, whether it's in South America, in Europe, in the Premier League, the Yanks are coming. Now, I don't know if we should go back to the war days when they took their time coming over, but when they eventually came, we thought, flipping out, they're over here. They're oversexed, they're overpaid, and what else were they? But nevertheless, they're here to stay, aren't they?
And they've spread out towards North Wales, I am led to understand.
Is it North Wales, though? That is the question. I can see a Hollywood thriller coming out of this.
Talking about US cultural product. Are you a fan of the original Star Trek? You know, the William Shatner. Yeah, obviously. Yeah. Do you remember the one where they pick up a group of intergalactic hippies?
Yeah.
Who are on their way to the promised land.
I think
going down to Eden.
This rings a bell. Yes.
Yeah. And these group of intergalactic hippies, they round on Captain Kirk, and they see him as just a symbol of squaredom and authority.
Well, he was.
And the way that they express this is just to surround him and say over and over again, Herbert, 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 which is a way of introducing our guest. Come on down, Ian Herbert.
Yeah, one of our own. Ian.
I'd say that's the better introduction than any I've ever known. I can't believe no one's thought of it earlier.
Well, I didn't know where it was going to end.
No, that's right.
I thought I'll leave it because the Legendino, he's got this new sexy deep voice, which I suspect is the lurgy, but never mind that. I thought, let him do his piece. This will be like a Hollywood audition for him. He's got the voice for it, hasn't he? He's got the voice. We don't know where it will end. But great to have you on board the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast.
Great to be on the pod. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we always look at an iconic game from some time in the past and sort of reflect on it.
Especially if Arsenal are losing to lower division opposition.
I'm staying out of that one. I'm staying well out of that one. We've already done Swindon Town in the League Cup final. The Gooners didn't like that, mate, and thought it was a little bit too biased towards White Hart Lane. But let's leave that to one side. It really is fascinating, this conversation today, because it takes on so many aspects of football, past, present, and future, to be frank. And this is one of those occasions where arguably the story is bigger than the game, even though, like Tim says, a lower league team did beat the arses. So, Ian, first of all, Wrexham, is it your home club? The way that your book, Tinseltown, starts is about you falling in love with the club, but is it still your club, as it were?
Yeah, that's right. I was brought up in a place called Chirk, which is just about 5 miles down the road, just on the border of Clwyd and Shropshire, as it was there, just on the England-Wales border. So, yeah, very much my club, and you know, a team that long before Hollywood film stars came over the horizon used to kind of attract 20,000 people for second division games, and always had a really big following and you know, a real critical mass of people. It was the club for North Wales. So until, you know, they sort of discovered it fell on harder times. So yeah, great.
That Hollywood input is crucial to my question, because we'll come to it later on, and that's part of the trajectory of the book as well. The challenge that Wrexham faced when 2 Hollywood stars decided to take the club over is whether it would remain the club it was, you know, and it's part of the story of Tinseltown. Where do we start with this book, though? Do we start in Wales or do we start in England? Where does Wrexham actually find itself? Is it English or is it Welsh?
Well, it's a curious one. It's obviously a curious one in the footballing sense, and it's always played in the English divisions. I mean, before there was a sort of a really well-established League of Wales, Swansea, Newport and Cardiff and Merthyr Tydfil they're well-established English sides, and there was then the chance to play in that Welsh league, the League of Wales, when it was created. I think it was in the 90s. But you can imagine why those clubs felt that there was more for them in actually continuing in the English Pyramid and playing bigger sides. But the loss for us at that stage was the chance to play and compete in the Welsh club, in the Welsh Cup, because it was winning the Welsh Cup that gave Wrexham some of the nights that many people from fanning out across the UK remember Wrexham for, which is playing clubs like Real Zaragoza, Roma, Porto in the Cup Winners' Cup back in the grainy days of the 80s. And, you know, when I sort of see people who I've never met and I start talking about Wrexham, that's what they remember. That's actually what they want to talk about rather more than Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney, I'm very, very glad to say.
Well, let's talk about that then. They got there through, well, sheer brilliance, didn't they? No, brilliance maybe is not the right word. They got into European football through hard work, maybe, but there's some togetherness about that club that made them winners at that time, which is what 90.
Yeah. What's the driving force behind the support? Because in my ignorance, I associate South Wales, especially the cities of South Wales, more with football. And then the more rural zones up to the north, I associate more with Welsh speaking and rugby.
Yeah.
So what's the dynamic there with this? And you talked about 20,000 people going to support them.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, there is the Welsh speaking contingent and kind of population in North Wales is predominantly up into right into northwest Wales, Tim, where Anglesey, Bangor, Carnarvon, places like this, the Llyn Peninsula, which are, you know, a good an hour's drive away from Wrexham. And, you know, I'm glad you asked me that, because in a sense, you know, Wrexham's place just 5 miles or so from the border puts them in a difficult position in terms of, you know, people don't really know where it is. Is it England? Is it in Wales? You know, you actually drive past it on the main A4, A3 bypass. You drive into Wales, and then the sooner you're into it, you're past Wrexham and out back into England again. So there's a curious geography of the border there. But I don't think it would be right to sort of kind of characterize it as North Wales being more of a rugby kind of place. I think culturally the rugby communities are very much in the south, around the former the mining communities of the valleys. I mean, it's a very strong mining history in North Wales, the Denbighshire coalfields, so very much a mining place, but very much football rather than rugby, I would say, always in the north of Wales.
Is there a footballing identity then to Wrexham?
I think it's complicated, and there are lots of different forms of that identity. But I think the Welshness is one. A place, despite being sort of close to the border, which is proud of its Welshness. I mean, the Welsh-speaking population of Wrexham is only about 12%, but there's certainly in the last 10, 15 years, I've sort of felt that more with the Wrexham Football Club Supporters Trust took over the club after a period of ne'er-do-wells running it and almost running it into the ground, and the Supporters Trust really brought back, I think, that kind of spirit of Welshness. The Welsh national anthem was sung far more. The anthem Imal Heath, Still Here, which is the Welsh rugby team and Welsh rugby team and football teams fans sing. So you see an awful lot more of that. But to come back to Tim's point about ruralness, I mean, there's always the kind of, I think there are lots of clubs who aren't in cities who always get the kind of the song about sheep and what fans like to do with sheep. But certainly Wrexham is one of those fan bases that has kind of counters that by singing songs in celebration of the sheep before they are sung at them. So I think that's a good way of getting back at that.
Why were, I mean, the joyous day, happy day that you want to take us back to in January of 1992? Why at that point were Wrexham so poor?
Well, I mean, they'd always really been it had always been slightly hand to mouth, actually, in some respects. I mean, we talk about some of those European games. I mean, I think it was the time of the Porto game. The fans were literally trying to raise money to help Wrexham buy a striker from Sheffield United. It was always a little bit like, bucket, whatever. What's the expression?
Yeah.
Shaking. So there's always a little bit of that. I mean, I think it was always a little bit hand to mouth. The attendances, like with a lot of clubs, could go up and down quite dramatically according to sort of where they were in the actual pyramid. So yeah, I mean, I just think it was that experience that all lower league clubs get of just trying to get the right players. And fortunately, the previous season, that would be 1990-91 season, there was no relegation from the old Division 4.
Wow.
So that gave Brian Flynn, our brilliant messiah of a manager, a season to actually blood young players, assess them, give them a go. And yeah, we did finish bottom of the league that season, but quite a number of that team went on to win promotion with Wrexham from Division 4 a couple of seasons after the Cup heroics of '92.
He's got in this team. He has two wily old class acts, both of whom are instrumental in the goals. You get Mickey Thomas, who had his glory days at Man United, who was class. He was a sneaky so-and-so, I always thought. Mickey Thomas. He knew all the tricks and a few more. And Gordon Davis, who was a legend at Fulham. But it seems to be basically them and a group of kids on the enterprise allowance scheme.
100%. Yeah, exactly so. Exactly. So, I mean, kids who became legends. I mean, a lot of people forget that one of those kids, Steve Watkins, scored the winner against Arsenal. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here and start talking about the game, but
no, you can enjoy the winner as often and as many times as you like.
You're kind. I mean, Mickey scored the iconic goal, but Steve Watkins, a 20-year-old, scored the actual winner. There was Carl Connolly, there was Gareth Owen, there was Wayne Phillips. These became legends for us of that team. Connolly was the only one of those who really went on to better things at QPR, which some may say is not better things, but it actually was. So yeah, I mean, but as you say, Tim, there was Gordon Davis and Mickey Thomas, and Mickey had a really good game that day. I mean, there was one. I remember one challenge on Jimmy Carter in the second half in the box, which probably VAR would probably rule a pen these days, but he was brave. 1-0 down already. It was risky, but he was 37 years old and he was still running hard. In the last 15 minutes of that game.
Well, it's obviously a huge day for him, isn't it? It's that day where he wants to send a message. You know what? I've been at this level and I can still play at this level. So
totally.
He's really going to turn the tap on. I've got a feeling that this is not a bad time to face Arsenal.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I do recall talk about them not having coming to that game in great form. I watched the video back, a good excuse to watch the game back, knowing we were going to talk about it. So thanks for the opportunity. And they had started their defence of the title quite poorly. They bought Ian Wright, but I think he was either cup-tied or suspended. Well, he must have been suspended. He was certainly out for that game. So they played Kevin Campbell instead. Campbell, who did play well, actually, but they certainly had not started or were halfway through that campaign, weren't they? They weren't defending their title well. There were quite a lot of bookings that day. There was just quite a lot of exasperation. You could tell that they didn't really look like a side who were really on it.
Yeah, because on the previous year, they nearly won the double. They won the league easily and went out in the FA Cup semi-final. And there was a view, I remember this vividly, the Evening Standard in London saying, George's boys will rule Europe. And that really was the expectation.
Yeah.
And then it didn't happen. They crashed out of the European Cup, the Champions League, early against Benfica. And you got the impression, and Rocastle, who for me was the symbol of that side that George Graham created, already he's on the downward slope. because defenses have worked out that he's all right foot. You just put him on his left foot, and he's less. And the side is starting to look a little bit less solid. You know, when you've had that moment of truth, you think you're good enough to take on Europe, and then it's not quite there. So I think that the Arsenal were a little bit, and it's still a huge shock result. And had Arsenal taken advantage of their first half domination, we wouldn't be talking
You're
about this game.
You're so right about that. I mean, I don't know what both of you remember of the overall piece of the game, but you're so right about that, because the reality of it was that the first half they absolutely battered Wrexham. You know, they were just so much the better side. We had Mark Sartori, who's I think now still a major part of the coaching staff at Man City, was with England for a while as a part of their coaching team, physio. And, you know, Campbell and Paul Merson just gave him such a hiding down the left-hand side in that first half. And it really looked over. You know, it was hard to see a way back.
Was he recently converted to a defender at that time?
That's right. Yeah, I think he was. Yeah.
I think you can probably tell.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I don't know whose idea that was, but anyway.
The Wrexham equaliser took its time coming, though, but it seemed as if you had better legs than the Arsenal the longer the game progressed, in any case. It seemed like Arsenal ran out of steam to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think there was a degree of frustration. I mean, Brian Flynn said after the game that teams who have so much of the ball get bored of it. They start doing sloppy things. They lose concentration. So I think there was a little bit of that about it. But there were those bookings I described. There was a bit of frustration creeping in. Obviously, you got, Wrexham did have young men, really relatively fresh players. There was a Mickey Thomas floated free kick at 1-0 down, just about 50 minutes before the equaliser, which Gordon Davies couldn't quite get on the end of. So there was the beginnings of a bit of a threat, and then the free kick came, and then all hell let loose. So I think you're right. There probably was a bit of fatigue setting in, and it was one of those great tight little third round venues, wasn't it?
Is that Mickey Thomas free kick your favourite ever moment as a Wrexham fan?
100%. I mean, writing the book's given me a chance to sort of people ask me questions about Wrexham and not shut me up and allow me to talk like this. And I mean, there are lots. And I think part of the experience of supporting a club in the lower leagues really is that, the kind of the heartache, the disappointment, the defeats. That's why all that's happened in some respects is still slightly difficult to entirely embrace in some ways. I don't know, there's something, don't we all feel a bit of that? We want to suffer in some ways as fans. But Tim, 100%, that was really the moment. And I mean, if I could talk for a moment about the takeover of the club by the Americans, there were some really resolute and determined people behind the scenes at Wrexham whose job it was to try to persuade the Americans to buy the club, because there were other contenders. And chap called Spencer Harris, who was the de facto chief executive of the Supporters Trust, which had kind of shepherded the club through its hardest times, put together a kind of a highlights reel of great goals at the racecourse, and that, of course, 100% was amongst them. So it was very much part of the sell, really, of Wrexham to the owners. And I can't remember much about the aftermath, but that's what it's like for us, isn't it, as fans, when all hell lets loose.
Well, I do blame David Seaman just a little bit. I always blame the keeper if it goes in his side.
Yeah,
and I think one of the things you see with Seaman is Seaman didn't come spurting out of his mouth. That was another occasion. But you just see he takes that fatal step to his left to cover the space behind his wall. And I always think that's a mistake, because if Mickey Thomas can get it over the wall and down again into being, then, credit to him. But the keeper, I think, has to take full responsibility for his side. his
Yeah.
side of the goal. And that little step that he takes to the left means that he can't quite get there to the right. And had he not taken that step, I think he might just have been able to make the save.
You know what? It's like 30 years since it happened, and I've never noticed that because I'm just too busy looking at Mickey teeing it up and hitting it. So when this conversation finishes, I'm going to go watch that back.
Yeah, well, that's why they call him the Legendino. But you will still suffer, by the way, as a fan, even though it's a different kind of suffering, but you will still suffer. So never mind that.
Well, let him enjoy the winner first.
Well, yeah.
There was a bit of motivational stuff going on there because you mentioned Gordon Davis, who was kind of 38 or whatever age he was, but Mickey tells a story about how when Nigel Winterburn threw the ball to Gordon Davis ahead of that free kick to return the ball to him, he kind of mimicked as if to suggest that Gordon was an old man. He was literally kind of walked like a granny on a Zimmer frame. And I've actually watched it. I've watched that bit back quite a lot because Mickey's adamant about this, and it does look a bit like that actually. So Mickey says his motivation really was to get one over on Winterburn for Davis. So you know.
But then what happens with the winner? And the winner comes exactly because Gordon Davis gets in the space behind Nigel Winterburn.
Totally, yeah, that's right. No, and that comes back to the point about that maybe they're just a bit of tiring. Maybe the concentration just slightly gone. Davis gets in, levers over a really good ball for Watkin. You know, considering that we're right in the depths of the game. This is not a young player. A great delivery, and then I think Watkin just gets in front of Adams and just kind of crowbars it in around his legs. So, but yeah, Davis was a key part of that game and certainly of that winner.
Yeah, so Tim, now that you've got the winner in, you should tell people what match we're talking about. It's from 1992, January 92, third round of the FA Cup, Wrexham versus Arsenal in the Racecourse Ground, which is always a name of a ground that was very special and dear to those of us who remember it being uttered once upon a time on a regular. It feels, and you've almost preempted this yourself, Ian, because it feels like there are two Wrexhams or timelines, Wrexham timelines. It's a kind of a before Christ and after Christ scenario. I'm not saying the Hollywood stars can ever be compared to, well, maybe Gabriel Jesus, but it feels, and this podcast is a story of two halves in a way. There's the match that clearly is very dear to your heart, but also there's the book which tells the story of what has been happening over the last few years. So how do we, where is the point of departure from Wrexham? You touched on it with when you were talking about the people behind the Yanks coming in. It felt like from reading your book, from reading Tinseltown, that the Yanks were going to come in anyhow, somewhere, not necessarily to Wrexham, and they had a story that was made in Hollywood. The story of David versus Goliath, or however you want to describe it, but certainly something of a fairy tale story set in either the Welsh valleys or the border with England, wherever it might be.
Yeah.
And at that point, Wrexham still had to appeal to the Yanks in how many different ways? What were they looking for?
Yeah, well, I mean, when they arrived, they were looking for a support base. That what do they say? Build it and they'll come. That there would be a critical mass of people who would come. They were looking for kind of a facility, a stadium. They were looking for a club without great levels of debt. So that they weren't going to have to spend $6 million just to sort of clear the debt. And I mean, those were three of the key criteria. But for me, the pivotal moment was not. What I tried to get across in the book is to try to move away from this idea that Wrexham were this damsel in distress who needed rescuing by the Americans, and that there was a sense of before Rob and Ryan and after, because the real pivotal moment was 10 years earlier, when after Alex Hamilton, the kind of the owner who almost got them liquidated, and a sequence of other owners who really were only in it for the property development, like in a way that so many lower league clubs experience, the club were just really absolutely bust. You know, they got a 10-point deduction from the Football League. They've been relegated to the National League. And it was in 2011 that the Wrexham Supporters Trust took over the club and began the job of kind of clearing the debt, and making it a going concern and keeping it alive. And if it weren't for that club, for that trust, not only keeping it alive, of course, but also creating a situation where there was no debt, there would be no Hollywood story. So the real heroes of the story are, as I say, are Spencer, certainly as what Spencer Harris is one of those people, but the individuals who saved it from kind of liquidation 10 years earlier. That's
such an important point, and I hope you can shout that from the rooftops.
I'm so glad to have the chance to sort of talk a bit about it, because I do think there's a bit of compassion fatigue about. I understand this about Reynolds and McElhenney. I think there's a lot of perhaps understandable kind of cynicism about the razzle dazzle and about all of the hoopla that goes with it. I mean, I watched the England-Scotland game. I don't know if you noticed on that game, the advertising hoardings around the game were advertising "Welcome to Wrexham" at the England-Scotland match, for goodness sake. And I think there's been just so much out there, so much noise and so much clever creative content that people just think, I mean, a few people have said to me, not more on Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. And certainly I've tried to understand and report on how the deal was done and what motivated Ryan in particular. But what matters to me more than anything else is to say, well, you know, Wrexham wasn't bust, the town wasn't bust, it was there, it was just about sort of surviving, just about making its way in the National League. And because of that, there was something there, material to actually take over and build from.
Do these Americans, do they understand? Because the way that you've told the story makes this absolutely clear. Do they understand that they are not owners, that they are custodians of a tradition which has been established and kept alive by local people? Do you think they understand that?
I think they do. I think, I mean, time will tell, Tim, in its entirety. I think they do. You know, they seem to be, you know, emotionally intelligent people. They seem to be very clear on the idea of this not coming across as A, some kind of savior complex, and B, not being the Yanks coming in and Americanizing it. I think there are moments where, you know, there's a clash of those cultures. I mean, you know, for me, I mean, the club are now sponsored by the club jersey is now sponsored by United Airlines. So United sits across the front of the jersey, which, you know, I mean, you can't have it always. You can't buy expensive players and not have corporate sponsors, but that really still slightly sticks in the craw for me. I don't I don't like that particularly. The stadium is sponsored by you know, an American cold coffee firm. For me, the de facto stadium sponsor will always be Wrexham Lager, whose products we sing about every week at the racecourse. So, I mean, I do think it's not quite a perfect fit, but you can't have it always. I mean, no one within Wales was really going to come along and, you know, inject the kind of money to get us out of the National League, playing great clubs like, you know, Ebbsfleet and Eastleigh every week, but clubs that, quite frankly, we didn't really want to be playing forever and a day. So, so yeah, I think all the signs are good that they do get that. And one of the key characters in the background in the build-up to all of this and the taking was a guy called Steve Horowitz, that finance guy from New York, who has brought a number of American owners to the UK, including FSG, Liverpool's owners, and he does preach the mantra of custodianship, as you put it so well.
There's a very, very different experience of Americans owning English or Welsh or British football clubs in Wrexham than there is anywhere else in the country. I can say that by a country mile. And I wonder whether, I mean, the one thing that you haven't mentioned is whether they're in it for the money, which seems to be the narrative of the Americans who come into, whether it's, well, clearly Manchester United, but Liverpool and Chelsea and anywhere else thrown in as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think ultimately, of course, they would. It would be ridiculous to say that they're not in it for the money, insofar as they're in it because they saw Wrexham as, a piece of, you know,
Piece of theatre, maybe.
Yep.
had, and they saw what a beautiful piece of filmmaking that was about, a team which had lost its way slightly and was from a working class community, and where people loved the bones of the club. So to come back to your point, I think that they obviously saw that there was some filmmaking gold in all of that. And they get a deal with FX, to actually, a £2 million contract to produce 2 series of Welcome to Wrexham. So that's what's underpinned the whole thing. And it's certainly, built their own. I mean, that's been, I think, a commercial phenomenon in itself, a Disney phenomenon. However, I would say that there's a really interesting sort of piece of philanthropy about this. I think it's an American-Canadian thing. I think about, very, very wealthy people wanting to try and work out what to do with their money. And I think that's probably something, and Tim, you might have experienced it. Well, I think you might. I know you spent time in the Americas, just that sort of feels to me something which is a bit different to a British form of philanthropy, which is, I think it's quite micro and it's quite granular. It's sort of it's like kind of about helping towns to help themselves, really, and build themselves up. However, I mean, that might just be, I might be talking nonsense, but that's just my impression. I've not had the chance to speak to them. It would have been great to have done that. That was made clear to me early on that because of their contractual duties to Disney, I would not be able to speak to them. But I have spoken to a bunch of people who I think are probably close to them.
Taking it back closer to home. Just so happens that I was at college with loads of Welsh people, and there was one girl from the north, from a Welsh-speaking family, and I remember like the last day of term when her dad came down to collect her, and she introduced him to some other Welsh people from the south, and he just took a look at him and said, "Oh, you're not Welsh, you're Welsh Yankees," like so. Now that the real Yankees have emerged, is there a pole of resistance to this in the heartlands?
No, I don't think there is. I think the pole of resistance to it really is in outside of Wrexham. I think a lot of opposition clubs fans do feel irked by the razzmatazz and the noise around Wrexham, by everything that Welcome to Wrexham has brought, and I think that's probably quite understandable. I mean, the sport we love is one where we're all cynical about the other team and never cynical, perhaps enough about ourselves. So I think there is a very sort of strong resistance in some parts of perhaps the lower leagues to this, because they just see all that's brought. But in North Wales itself, and it comes back to wanting to say, this is a brilliant town, like so many brilliant towns in the backwoods of England and Wales and Scotland, where there are some great people doing fantastic stuff to, in the absence of kind of adequate government funding for local councils or God knows what in those towns, people are doing it for themselves, are building the town up for themselves, are helping it to keep alive for themselves. And what these owners have done is, I think, put a slight spring in people's step in a really indefinable, unquantifiable way. People just feel a bit better about themselves because, a lot of people in the world are talking about them. So, and it's indefinable that. So I think when the takeover happened, when their identities were not known, there was definitely a difficult decision and process, and there was resistance in some parts within the supporters' trust, because this could be just another bunch of ne'er-do-wells looking to sort of, kind of just make a few dollars and run off. But right now, I would say there's no sense of kind of negativity. There's a lot of warmth and a feeling that they've not looked down on us. They've not laughed at us, although you should say perhaps that should be a given, but that's not happened.
And have they paid due respect? Do they pay due importance to this team that beat Arsenal in January 1992? Are this team still part of the present?
I thought you meant the Yanks. You're talking about the fans, the supporters.
No, I'm talking about the Yanks. I mean, and the respect that, do they have that respect for the club's history and tradition? Is Steve Watkin at the ground meeting and greeting and getting paid to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the people that they looked to connect with immediately was Dixie McNeil, who obviously from a slightly earlier era. My first times watching Wrexham were sort of around the late 70s, the Dixie era. So they were careful to, I think, to try to understand what that's about. I think what the Americans love about lower league British football, and that's why Americans own Portsmouth and Americans own Dagenham and Redbridge, etc., is that they do love this sense of a small town club can run up and down the pyramid, can face an Arsenal, in a way that in the franchise sport, of the USA, that would never happen. So I think they love all of that. McElhenney in particular, I think, has got a real feel for it, and I think has spent a lot of time genuinely trying to understand it. So, I suppose there's something in all of us which kind of, perhaps to harbour a bit of cynicism about this. But I mean, I know I'm a fan and they've done great stuff and they've got us out of the league, but I do find it hard to be too cynical about that. And I do think they have done their homework.
Well, Welcome to Wrexham deserves a soundtrack, doesn't it? It's like out on the streets, they call it murder. And thankfully, we have got a soundtrack to this match that we've been talking about. January 1992. Oh, Tim will be delighted at what's number one, Ian. Are you also, you're a big fan of Queen, as Tim Vickery is?
Yeah, I'm a fan of Queen, certainly. I'm sort of delighted to see that. I mean, what better track could there have been for number one at that time, Tim? Or either of you? Dotun, what do you think?
Well, I absolutely despise it.
Oh, no.
It just makes me spew with rage. I never understand the
I just did not read the irony in the.
Apologies. I apologize. Yeah, you can't
flattering with incoherent rage.
But for those of us who do, for those of us,
can you sell this? The track we're talking about is Bohemian Rhapsody. Can you sell this to me? Because I've always found it the biggest load of absolute schlock nonsense. The comparison I would make, because it's obviously the use of the studio. You're getting to the comparison I would make is with "I'm Not in Love" by 10cc, which uses the studio, but "I'm Not in Love" uses it to emotional effect.
Okay,
you get that lovely weightless thing, that really strange atmosphere of "I'm Not in Love," which always leaves the question hanging, I think, over the song. Is he lying?
Called Echo.
Is he lying to himself?
Yeah.
Is he? Yeah. So there is, the studio is used to produce and enhance an emotional effect. What on earth is the emotional effect of Bohemian Rhapsody? What on earth is it? It's just nonsense.
Ian, do you want to take this first, and I'll back you up?
Yeah, well, I think I probably would say that I've just not been perhaps as analytical as I might have been, but it just kind of
no.
It's just a track, a soundtrack of easier days when life was sweet, and that's it for me.
That's good enough.
Scaramouche. Can you get a fandango? Or whatever?
That's good enough. First of all, remember, Freddie Mercury's just died at this point. That's why it's back at number one. I'm pretty sure this is time when
so.
it died around 1992, if I remember correctly. And so that's why it's back at number one. So it's not its first time at number one at all. And over the span of, by now, what, 20 something years, about 20 years, it's still back at number one. So it may not have emotional resonance for you, Tim, but for a lot of people it has. And it's not necessarily in what is contained in the song and the way that you make the comparison with 10cc's I'm Not in Love. Sometimes songs aren't supposed to be like that. Sometimes what he's done here, and I can see this as someone who's just trying to write a book or publish a book myself, that is what some people might describe as an idiosyncratic, unusual, or
it's
some
certainly
people...
idiosyncratic to name your autobiography after Lionel Jeffries.
It's called Effries, by the way, Ian.
Right.
Effries. But what I was going to say is, why not be experimental? Why not be adventurous? Why not try and take a pop song into another realm? We didn't understand all of this when I was 12 years old or so when it came out. I didn't understand it. You know, the clever clogs in the classroom always thought, yeah, this is brilliant, you know, and they talked about a world that I could only imagine, a world with the likes of Led Zeppelin in, that you've mentioned before as one of your pet hates as well, for the right reasons in that respect. But in this respect, here is a group, actually, I think they're doing it tongue-in-cheek. So talk about irony, Ian, that's the biggest irony of all, if you don't get that. You know, Scaramouche, Let Me Do the Fandango, they are on the verge of turning themselves into absurdities. If that refrain doesn't work, they become a flipping laughing stock. They, you know, they literally become Spinal Tap. Everybody's going to be doing that for forever and taking the mickey out of them, but they make it work.
Yeah,
I think
that's like everyone's still doing that too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I demand the names and addresses of these people.
Of course you do. Of course you do. But apart from that, does any of the other songs, tracks in the charts grab you by any chance, Ian?
Well, it was "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me," wasn't it? George Michael and Elton John, which I think, I don't know.
More 70s schlock reissued.
More 70s schlock, but I suppose
it's a great song.
Emotional times, you know, in football, bringing it back to that, an emotional game, and that just to see that is also, if you forgive the slightly, I don't know, kind of sentimental perspective on it, you know, my team had just finished bottom of the football league, and there we were. That there's a song title for those times, really. You know, we kind of rallied, we regrouped around a bunch of young players, and we're kind of slightly reborn that season and the next season. And there was an incredible beauty about that, which we are not seeing now. You know, in this current Wrexham, it is not. It is inorganic now. You know, they bought a bunch of very, very good players, including striker called Paul Mullet, you know, who's like the best striker probably in League Two as he was in the National League. But that was organic. That was a sort of football that perhaps doesn't belong to any of us anymore. That sense of actually getting a bunch of young people together in what is now the EFL and being able to thrive by giving them a go. I mean, those days are gone, aren't they? It's just all about the money now. So don't let the sun go down on me. We did not let the sun go down on us.
Well, I look at it more from a Shakespearean perspective, as you'd expect. Well, no, I'll tell you why in just a moment. Yeah. First of all, great song, and it was a moment of genius for George Michael and Elton John to do this together as a duet. But I always refer to the opening lines of Richard III when he says, "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by that son of York." And then you ask yourself, is it son, S-O-N, or S-U-N?
I've got to say, a bit like David Seaman's movement before Nicky Thomas free kicks. I've never thought of that. I need to revisit that. This is the best part of it all. This really is. I just start reaching realms that
Oh
musicality.
my God. Let's move swiftly on to number 6. Live and Let Die. But
More
Guns N'
70s schlock. It's just 70s schlock
but
revisited, isn't it?
Guns N' Roses.
What's your fave on the list?
Me? Or
Tim.
no, Tim, yeah.
I mean,
Tim.
you and I quite like this stuff, right? Don't we
Exact-
like this stuff? But
Well, Dotun will like anything as long as it's
No, I don't
successful.
like it all. I don't like it all, but yeah, go
Yeah,
on.
he does. That's
No,
he's a
not-
former music journalist, so
No,
if
no.
it's selling, it's good. It's also the point
It's
of view of a
true.
publisher.
It's
No,
true.
that's
That is true.
if
That's
it's
all
making
true.
money for someone, it's good.
It's good, yeah.
There's not a lot that I like really. There's a couple that kind of stand out as the moment for me, and the Kim Sims thing, Too Blind to See It. I don't particularly like it, but it that just kind of captures the dance sound of that time. And there's one which is terrible really, but also kind of captures the sound, the zeitgeist of the time for me, which is by Shaft, and it's Rhubarb and Custard, and they've just ecstasied Rhubarb and Custard. It's kind of ironic, and it's crap, and it's danceable in a way that people were at that time.
Yeah.
At 3 o'clock in the morning saying, I'm an orange. So although I don't think I'd ever listen to it out of choice again, it does capture the moment for me. Rhubarb and Custard by Shaft.
I like it.
I'm surprised that those are the ones that caught your attention, because I think one thing that I don't like about this chart is seeing so many half decent R&B artists, and I'm including Diana Ross in that half decent, being turned over as sort of like pop disco or whatever it is that they're doing to them at this point.
I love Diamonds and Pearls by Prince.
I was going to say, why didn't you mention that?
Yeah,
why didn't you mention
down at number 30, and it took me a long time to get down that way.
But you jumped up as soon as you saw it, didn't you?
Yeah,
that is one of the classics on this. But also, I would say, "Killer" by Seal was an amazing track. With
I've never really liked him.
Have you heard the bass line on this?
Yeah. It does.
All right. I mean, that is such a groove that you could hear. I could hear, even though it's not a reggae thing, I could hear the late great Robbie Shakespeare playing that bass line and just making it pump. And the very present, still alive Sly Dunbar keeping the groove going at the back of it.
What were you making at this time of Michael Jackson?
Me?
He's just come out, because he's just come out with black and white.
Yeah, he's missed his peak at this point. He's on the slide downwards. Remember, I chased him around in 1988, sent there by one of the tabloids when he first came over as a solo artist to the UK, and then he would have been promoting the Thriller album, or just moving into Bad. Maybe was he moving into Bad? Yeah, I think he had moved into Bad actually at this point, and you could just about tolerate it through clenched teeth, as I'm trying to do now, because he'd become this, super pop idol, whereas we were still thinking of him as R&B. We were still thinking of Michael.
But also, I think in retrospect, you can hear that some of the when he reaches that commercial peak, you can hear some of it now as a person in decline, can't you? And Billie Jean is a great song about paranoia, about someone who can no longer trust anyone in the world. Wanna Be Starting Something is a song about the enormous pain of his existence, and we just took it as a celebration song. And now we're beginning to live with the downside of it in '92, aren't we? As he's on a decline as a human being.
Yeah, as a human being, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, I didn't know him personally, but perhaps so. Certainly not on an upswing in terms of his career, and he never recovers. He never recovers from the downward slide. This is what's so surprising, I think, about Michael Jackson. I think he was badly advised. I think he should, at this point, have gone the other way and either going backwards, career-wise or album-wise, to Off the Wall, or something even more radical towards the jazz world, which is where Off the Wall was coming from in any case, and much more so Thriller perhaps. But yeah, he should have gone the other way, whereas he chose to go for the global superstar thing, and I'm not sure elicited any great music from him. Anyway, never mind me. Is there an anthem to Wrexham's? Well, before and after, either
Hang on,
way.
there's the Pogues, Fairy Tale of New York.
That
Maybe that has something to
that
do
is
with what
probably
Wrexham.
the best tune in this charts, actually. Thank you very much for reminding me of that. Fairy Tale to New York. But yeah, you've been on a roller coaster and a fairy tale, you could argue. Ian, is there a soundtrack to it?
The soundtrack of that was 1978. It was a song called Wrexham is the Name. It was recorded on Spider Records. It was the fans singing the Wrexham anthem, Wrexham is the Name, to the tune of Men of Harlech. And it was the supporters singing it. And then at the very end, you've got the then manager, Arnold Griffiths, reading a roll call of the players out. It was one of those really terrible football records. And we could talk probably all afternoon and all night about bad football music, but the team still run out to it to this day, and it is still sung by us all every home game to this day. So, I mean, you were talking about, I suppose Americans will go, but there will always be the club, and these are the constants, and that is the soundtrack, which is the constant, and it is an anthem, that's for sure. More recently, there is David Yuan's Imo Heath, Still Here, which is again became part of the kind of the chorus, the soundtrack of the racecourse during the Wrexham Supporters Trust days. That's still sung, but yeah, Wrexham is the Name is the one. Spider Records,
and of course Bonnie Tyler's in the charts.
I think she's got a book coming out as well, hasn't she, Bonnie? So you need to get her on the.
Well, she's holding out for a hero.
What was in the charts in '92? Was that?
It'll be a total eclipse of something.
Holding out for a hero.
Holding out for a hero.
And
that would be Nicky Thomas or Gordon Davis. I mean, they've all got resonance.
Well, you wait for a hero. You hold out for a hero, and several come riding their white horses all the way from the far, far west, or the wild, wild west. It's been a race course of a ride for you lot, and long may it continue. The book is called Tinseltown. It's by our guest Ian Herbert. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks.
It's been such great fun to talk to you guys. Thanks for having me on. Thank you.
Anytime.